Tonight, you are listening to true crime for sleep. There is no music here, no sudden sounds, and no rush. Just a calm voice, a slow pace, and a case told carefully with respect. Wherever you are right now, take a moment to settle in. If you are lying down, allow your body to sink into the mattress. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your hands rest where they naturally fall. And if your jaw has been tense without you noticing, let it soften slightly, as though there is nothing left to hold together. If you are sitting up, that is okay too. You do not need to force sleep. Sleep arrives on its own when the mind finally believes it is safe enough to let go, and tonight is simply a quiet space where you can slow down. Tonight's story is a well-known case in the United Kingdom. It is remembered not because it was loud, but because it was unsettling in its simplicity. A quiet street, a brief moment, and a person who seemed widely loved, followed by questions that even years later have never fully settled. This is the case of Jill Dando. Jill Dando was a familiar face to the British public, someone associated with television and everyday evenings at home. She carried a warmth and professionalism that people trusted. And when her life ended suddenly, it did not only affect her family and friends, it created a national shock that lingered, because it challenged the sense that ordinary life is protected by routine. Because this is a sleep-focused documentary, we will tell this story carefully. We will avoid graphic detail, keep our language respectful, and focus on confirmed facts wherever possible. When something remains disputed or uncertain, we will separate it clearly, so the story stays honest and grounded. Some cases have a clear path, where evidence forms a straight line from beginning to end. This is not one of those cases. The investigation in Jill Dando's murder moved in complex ways over time, with theories appearing and fading, and with legal outcomes that changed the shape of the story without fully resolving it. So tonight, we will move slowly through the setting, the timeline, the investigation, and the later legal developments. Not to stir fear, but simply to understand what can be understood, and then to let the story rest. And if you find your mind holding on too tightly to details, you can loosen your grip. You do not have to remember everything. You do not have to solve anything. You can let the words pass over you like soft rain, present for a moment, then gone. Take one slow breath in and let it out. Feel the calm in the pause between breaths, the small, quiet space where nothing is demanded from you. The night is here now, and in the quiet of the night, we begin. In 1999, London carried a familiar energy. It was busy, layered, and alive in the way the city always seems to be. With commuters moving through stations, taxis threading through traffic, and neighborhoods each holding their own quiet routines beneath the larger noise. It was the end of the decade, the edge of a new millennium, and there was a subtle feeling in the air that time was turning a page. The city was not frozen in history or distant from modern life. London in 1999 was already connected and fast. People used mobile phones, but not in the constant, screen-lit way we do now. The internet existed, but it was not woven into every moment of daily life. News still arrived through newspapers, radio, and television, and for many families, the evening schedule was shaped by what was on the screen. Television mattered more then, not only as entertainment, but as a shared cultural experience. Certain presenters and programs became part of the national rhythm. They were familiar in the background of living rooms, part of how people ended their day, part of the quiet companionship that TV can provide when you come home tired and switch something on. London itself held that strange combination of public closeness and private distance. You could stand shoulder to shoulder with strangers on the underground and still know nothing about them. You could live on the same street for years and only exchange small greetings. It was a city where people moved around each other constantly, and yet so much of life remained personal and unseen. The neighborhoods of London each carried their own atmosphere. Some areas felt loud and fast, built around offices and late-night movement. Others felt quieter, more residential, with tree-lined streets, tidy front gardens, and the kind of daily calm that can make you forget you are still in one of the biggest cities in the world. It is important to remember this setting because the murder of Jill Dando took place in a part of London that felt like that quieter side, not a dramatic location, not a place that looked dangerous. It was the kind of street people pass through without thinking. The kind of place where the biggest sounds might be a car, door closing, or footsteps on the pavement. When a serious crime happens in a setting like that, it creates a particular kind of shock. The mind expects danger to be loud or obvious, something you can see coming. But real life does not always work that way. Sometimes harm arrives quietly, in places that look safe enough to trust. In 1999, London was also a city with a growing awareness of celebrity. Media attention was strong. Public figures were widely recognized. Newspapers were competitive. Headlines were bold. And the line between public life and private life could feel thin for anyone in the spotlight. But at the same time, the world still had fewer cameras in every pocket. Social media did not exist in the way it does now. There were no constant updates and live streams from the public. News moved at a slower pace, but it also had a stronger sense of authority. When people heard something on the evening news, it carried weight. This matters because the case we are moving into was not only a tragedy, it was a national story. And in that era, national stories felt different. They were shared in a more unified way. People heard the same names and saw the same images, often at the same time, across the country. The police culture and investigative landscape of the late 1990s also looked different from what we know today. CCTV existed in London and was already expanding, but it was not as advanced as it would become later. Technology helped investigations, but it did not solve them quickly. Many cases still relied heavily on witness statements, physical evidence, forensic work, and patience. Forensic science was developing, but it had limits, especially compared to the expectations that modern true crime shows have sometimes created. Evidence had to be collected carefully. Laboratory work took time, and even when something was found, it did not always provide a complete answer. In this environment, a major case could grow into something overwhelming. It could generate public fear, intense media coverage, and pressure on police to make progress quickly. When the victim was someone well known, that pressure multiplied. The investigation became not only about finding the truth, but about doing it under a spotlight. London in 1999 was not a place without crime, but it was also not a place where people expected something like this to happen in broad daylight, on a residential street, to someone widely recognized and widely respected. That contrast is part of why this case still lingers in the public memory. It felt like a disruption to normal life, a reminder that even familiar places can hold sudden tragedy. And as we continue into the story of Jill Dando, it is worth holding on to that setting. A London that was modern but not yet fully digital. A city where television presenters were part of daily life. A country standing on the edge of a new millennium, still believing in the ordinary safety of routine. Because in the end, it is often routine that makes a crime feel so disturbing. The sense that everything looked normal until it did not. The sense that danger did not announce itself. The sense that a familiar city can become unfamiliar in a single moment. Jill Dando was someone many people in the United Kingdom felt they knew, even if they had never met. She was a familiar face on television, a calm and confident presence in people's living rooms, and a figure associated with the kind of programs that became part of everyday life. In an era when television was still one of the main ways the country shared information and stories, presenters carried a certain kind of trust. They were not just entertainers, they were guides. They spoke directly to the public, and over time, their voices and expressions became part of the background rhythm of home life. Jill Dando was born in 1961 and grew up in Weston-super-Mare in Somerset. Her early life was far from the bright, polished world of television studios. It was ordinary in the way most lives begin, shaped by family, school, and the slow unfolding of personality as someone grows into adulthood. Before she became nationally known, she worked in local journalism. This was the beginning of a career built on communication, clarity, and presence. People who succeed in broadcasting often have a particular balance of qualities. They can speak with confidence without sounding distant. They can hold attention without demanding it. They can bring warmth into serious moments without turning them into performance. Jill was known for that balance. Her career grew steadily. Over time, she became associated with major BBC programming. She presented news segments, and she also became a recognizable figure through popular public-facing shows, including Crimewatch, a program built around appeals for information in unsolved cases. Crimewatch held a unique place in British television. It was not simply entertainment. It was a collaboration between broadcasting and policing, designed to reach the public with information about crimes, reconstructions, and appeals for help. Viewers watched because it felt important, because it was linked to real people, because it carried the sense that ordinary members of the public could play a role in solving cases. Jill Dando's presence on Crimewatch made her associated with justice and public service, even though she was not a police officer. She became part of how the country thought about crime prevention and public awareness. She represented something steady and reliable, someone who could deliver serious information in a way that felt calm and human. She also presented other widely watched programs, including Holiday, which placed her in a very different setting. That contrast made her even more familiar to viewers. She was not only seen in serious, structured segments, she was also seen in the lighter, everyday tone of travel and leisure programming, the kind that people watched to relax. The public saw Jill in multiple roles, and because of that, she became a figure who felt integrated into national life. She was professional, polished, and well-liked. Not the kind of celebrity known for controversy, but the kind known for reliability. When a person is known in this way, the boundary between public presence and private life becomes thin. People do not know the details of your day-to-day existence, but they still feel a sense of closeness, because they have watched you for years. They know your face. They know your voice. They associate you with certain emotions and routines. That is one of the reasons her death caused such shock. It did not feel like something distant happening to an unknown name. It felt like something happening to someone who belonged, in a quiet way, to the country's shared sense of normal. But Jill Dando was more than her public image. She was a real person beyond the camera. She had family and friends who knew her without studio lights and scripts. She had private joys, private stress, private conversations that the public never saw. In the months before her death, Jill's life included personal changes and plans for the future. Confirmed reporting at the time indicated that she had become engaged and was preparing for a new chapter. This detail was often mentioned because it made the loss feel even more cruel. The sense that life was moving forward, and that the future was being arranged with hope. When we speak about her public presence, it is also important to recognize that her work placed her in a very particular position. Crimewatch, by its nature, deals with real crime. It involves naming cases. It involves reconstructing events. It involves putting information into the public space. Because of this, and because of the role she played in presenting those appeals, it was natural that people wondered whether her job had made her a target. That idea became one of the lasting questions around the case, and it remains part of the broader theories and speculation. Jill Dando was a respected broadcaster. She was known widely and generally liked. She was associated with programs that connected directly to public life. She lived as a public figure. but she was also a private person with a future ahead of her. And when someone like that is lost suddenly, it does something to the national mind. It creates a moment where people stop and look at the world differently. It creates a feeling that safety is less certain than it appeared. It creates the kind of shock that does not fade quickly. Because the public had seen Jill Dando so often, her absence was not abstract. People felt it, they noticed it. They heard the news and felt as though something stable had been removed from the cultural landscape. And for those closest to her, the loss was far deeper than anything the public could fully understand. For family and friends, it was not the loss of a public figure. It was the loss of the person they knew in ordinary moments. The person who laughed without cameras present. The person who spoke on the phone. The person who made plans for the weekend. The person who returned home, expecting tomorrow to be normal. That is the truth underneath the case. A real life, a real future, a person who mattered. Jill Dando was a life, not a headline, a human being, not a theory. And remembering her that way is one of the most respectful things we can do, even as we move into the timeline of the day her life was taken. On the morning Jill Dando was killed, the day began in the ordinary way that so many days do. There was nothing in the sky that would have warned anyone. Nothing in the streets that would have signaled what was about to happen. London was moving as it always moved, with small routines unfolding behind doors, and quiet moments passing unnoticed. It was Monday, the 26th of April, 1999. Jill was 37 years old. She was living in Fulham, a residential area in West London that often feels calm despite being close to the energy of the city. The streets there are lined with houses and small front steps, and in the daytime, it is the sort of place where people come and go without feeling exposed. That morning, Jill left her home and went out to buy a newspaper. It was a simple errand, the kind of small task that people do without thinking of it as significant. She walked locally, returned, and continued with the quiet flow of the day. At some point later that morning, Jill arrived back at her home in Gowan Avenue. What happened next took place in a very short span of time, in a space that should have been safe. A front doorway, a familiar street, a moment of routine turning into something irreversible. Because this is a sleep-focused documentary, we will not go into graphic descriptions. We will speak in a calm way and stay with the confirmed core facts. Jill Dando was shot outside her home. She was found on the doorstep, and emergency services were called. Despite efforts to help her, she died from her injuries. The shock of this detail is hard to overstate, even now, not only because of the violence of it, but because of the location. The front step of a home is usually associated with arrival, not danger. It is the place where people greet neighbors, accept deliveries, and step inside out of the weather. It is not where most people expect a life to end. The timing of the event was also unsettling. This was not late at night. It was not in a hidden alleyway. It was the middle of the day, in a residential London street, with people living close by. When a crime happens under those conditions, it creates immediate questions. Who could do this and leave so quickly? How could it happen without being seen clearly? Why her? Why there? Why then? In the earliest moments, police response would have been swift and intense. The killing of a well-known BBC presenter was not a routine crime to handle. It became urgent instantly, not only because of who Jill was, but because of what it suggested. That someone could approach her home, commit a murder at the doorstep, and vanish into the city. At the scene, officers worked to secure the area and begin gathering evidence. In cases like this, where events unfold quickly and the offender leaves almost immediately, every detail matters. Anything left behind, any witness who heard something, any observation that might seem small becomes valuable. This is also where time becomes critical. The earlier evidence is collected, the better chance there is of preserving it. Outdoor scenes are fragile. Weather changes, people walk past, cars move through. Even the normal activity of a neighborhood can begin to disturb what might have been left behind. Witness accounts from that morning became a major focus very quickly. People nearby reported hearing a loud noise. Some described it as a bang, something that drew their attention. Others may have seen a man in the area, but as with many fast-moving cases, the witness information was not fully clear in a single direction. London is a city where people pass each other constantly. Seeing a stranger on a street is normal. Hearing a noise and looking out the window does not always provide a clear image. And when a crime lasts only seconds, the chance of someone seeing the key detail at the exact right moment can be small. Still, investigators worked to build a timeline. They focused on Jill's movements that morning, the moments before she reached her doorstep, and what could be established about the immediate area. They needed to determine whether she had been followed, whether someone had been waiting, whether there were signs of planning. Because this kind of crime, carried out at a person's home in daylight, can suggest a targeted attack. It suggests an offender who knew where the victim lived, and who had enough confidence or intent to act quickly and leave. That possibility shaped early thinking. At the same time, police would have considered whether the attack could have been random, whether it could have been a mistaken identity, whether it could have been connected to something Jill did in her work, or something in her personal life. Investigations begin by holding multiple possibilities open, then narrowing them as evidence either supports or eliminates each one. For Jill Dando's colleagues, friends, and family, the news arrived like a shockwave. In cases involving public figures, the public hears the news quickly, but those closest to the person experience it in a different way. It is not a headline. It is a call that changes everything. It is disbelief turning into grief in the space of seconds. The BBC and the wider media reacted immediately. There was an awareness that this was not only a tragedy, but an event that would reshape public attention. Jill was not a distant celebrity. She was a broadcaster known for calmness and warmth. Someone many people trusted. Someone many people associated with home life. And now, she was gone. The fact that the murder took place outside her home created a lasting unease. Homes represent boundaries. They represent privacy. They represent the line between the public world and the place where you can relax. When violence crosses that line, it leaves behind a different kind of fear. The feeling that safety is not only about where you go, but about whether safety exists at all. In the hours and days that followed the murder, police began a major investigation. It was one of the largest in Britain at the time. They gathered forensic evidence. They interviewed witnesses. They examined Jill's personal and professional life. They looked for threats, unusual contacts, and any detail that could suggest motive. But on that morning itself, the moment was defined by its suddenness. A familiar street, a quiet doorway, a life ending in seconds, and a city left with questions, not only about who committed the crime, but about how it could have happened so quickly, in such a normal place, to someone so visible. This is the morning Jill Dando was killed, and it was the moment that turned a normal day into a case that the country would remember for decades. In the minutes after Jill Dando was found outside her home, the situation changed from private shock to public emergency. Neighbors and passers-by became aware that something serious had happened, and the first calls for help were made. In cases like this, those early minutes can feel blurred and unreal, even for people who are fully awake, because the mind does not easily accept that a normal morning has turned into a crime scene. Police and emergency services arrived quickly. At first, the priority would have been medical assistance, doing whatever could be done in the moment. But as the reality became clear, the street itself began to change. A quiet residential space turned into an area of urgent activity. Doors opened, curtains moved, voices lowered. People stood still, trying to understand. Very soon, officers began securing the scene. This is one of the most important steps in any investigation, especially when the crime occurs outdoors. Outdoor scenes are fragile. Evidence can be disturbed by weather, by movement, by curiosity, and by the simple reality that people live nearby and will naturally come outside to see what is happening. To investigate a crime properly, the scene has to be protected. Access has to be limited. The area has to be managed carefully. And in a case like this, where the victim was a public figure and the location was in a residential street, police would have been under immediate pressure to move quickly while still being precise. Early evidence collection involves a careful balance. Officers and forensic teams must document what they find without altering it. They must record the position of items, the condition of the area, and anything that might have been left behind. It can be slow, methodical work, and it often happens while the world around it is full of noise and emotion. In the murder of Jill Dando, the early evidence was centered around the doorstep area outside her home. Investigators needed to understand what had happened in that narrow space. They needed to know how the offender approached, how quickly the crime occurred, and what the offender might have left behind. One of the confirmed points in reporting around the case is that Jill was shot once. This is an important detail because it shaped the way investigators thought about the offender. A single shot can indicate a targeted act. It can suggest confidence, intent, and the desire to act quickly rather than create chaos. But it can also suggest that the offender wanted to reduce attention, to minimize noise, and to disappear into the surrounding streets before anyone fully realized what had happened. The sound of a gunshot was reported by people nearby. Some described hearing a loud bang. In a city environment, noises can be misinterpreted easily. A car backfiring, construction, a door slamming. But in this case, the sound became part of the timeline, a moment that drew attention, even if it did not immediately reveal the truth. Investigators would have spoken to residents in the area as quickly as possible. Witness accounts are time-sensitive. The longer people wait, the more memory becomes shaped by discussion, news, and the natural human tendency to fill in gaps. So early interviews focus on what was seen or heard before the mind begins to rearrange it. In these early conversations, police would have asked about strangers in the street, unfamiliar vehicles, unusual movements, and anything that felt out of place. They would have asked about the timing, about what people were doing when they heard the noise, about whether anyone saw someone leaving quickly. One of the most challenging aspects of street-level crimes in a city is that strangers are normal. A person walking by does not automatically stand out. A car parked near a house does not automatically look suspicious. London streets are full of movement and small coincidences. That is why investigators must gather many small pieces of information and see which ones align. Forensic evidence was also crucial in these early stages. Investigators would have searched for physical traces that could point to the offender. In a shooting, they may look for the cartridge or casing. They may look for any marks or residue. They may look for footprints, fibers, or any trace left by contact with the environment. However, the reality of forensic work is that evidence is not always clean or complete. Outdoor conditions can degrade or remove traces. A small object can be kicked or missed. Rain can wash away things that might have mattered. A narrow window of time can determine what is found and what is lost. In Jill Dando's case, one reported element of the early investigation involved the possibility that the offender approached and left on foot. This makes sense in a residential London street. A person walking away would blend into normal life quickly, especially if dressed in ordinary clothing. A person could turn one corner and vanish into the larger city within minutes. Police also began, early on, to explore the idea that the crime was targeted. This was not because they had immediate proof of motive, but because of the circumstances. Jill was a well-known public figure. The attack occurred at her home. The action was quick and specific. These factors often lead investigators to consider that the offender may have known who she was and where she lived. At the same time, a careful investigation must also consider other possibilities. Mistaken identity, a random act, a personal dispute unrelated to public life, a fixation by an individual who had no direct connection to Jill. Early investigations often hold multiple theories open until evidence begins to narrow them. During the first police response, another priority would have been documenting Jill's recent movements and communications. Investigators needed to understand the hours leading up to her death, where she had been, who she had spoken to, whether there were any unusual events, calls, or messages, whether she had expressed fear or concern to anyone close to her. This is the quiet work that often happens behind the scenes, far from the public eye. A case may appear to the public as a single dramatic event, but to investigators, it becomes a complex map of relationships, routines, and patterns. The media presence also became intense very quickly. Jill Dando was famous, and the murder of a famous person creates an immediate storm. News organizations began reporting rapidly. The public began to gather information. The pressure on the investigation grew heavier by the hour. For police, this pressure can be dangerous. It can push an investigation towards speed rather than precision. It can encourage decisions that satisfy public demand rather than evidence. And that is why experienced investigators often try to keep the focus steady, even when cameras and headlines are pushing for answers. In the early days, police appeals to the public became part of the case. They asked for witnesses. They asked for anyone who had seen something unusual to come forward. They asked for information about people in the area at the time of the crime. In a city like London, these appeals can generate a huge amount of response. Some of that response is useful, some of it is not. But police must sift through it carefully, because even one small observation can matter. The first police response and early evidence collection in the Jill Dando case set the foundation for one of the largest investigations in modern British history. It created the first timeline, the first list of witnesses, the first set of forensic findings, and the first sense of investigative direction. And as the case moved forward, that early foundation became crucial. Because when a case remains unsolved for years, the earliest evidence is often what matters most. It is the closest to the truth, the least shaped by rumor, the least damaged by time. In the quiet aftermath of that first day, a familiar London street had been transformed. The doorway of a home had become the center of a national tragedy, and the police, already under pressure, were now carrying a case that the entire country would watch, waiting for answers that did not come easily. In the hours and days after Jill Dando was killed, one of the first priorities for investigators was to gather witness accounts. When a crime happens quickly, in a residential street, with an offender who disappears almost immediately, witnesses can become the closest thing to a direct connection between the event and the person responsible. But witness accounts are also delicate. They are human memory, and human memory is not a recording. It is shaped by stress, by surprise, and by the way the mind tries to make sense of something it did not expect to see. In a neighborhood like Fulham, people come and go constantly. Someone leaving for work, someone walking to the shops, a delivery arriving, a person passing by with no connection to anything. Because of this, what matters most in witness statements is not only what someone remembers, but whether that memory can be placed accurately in time. Investigators began speaking with residents on Gowan Avenue and the surrounding streets. They asked about what people heard and what people saw. They asked when those sounds or sights occurred. They asked whether anyone noticed a person lingering near Jill's home. They asked whether anyone saw a vehicle parked strangely or moving away quickly. One of the most commonly reported details in the case was that some neighbors heard a loud bang. In the moment, some people may have thought it was something ordinary. A car, a door, a small explosion from everyday life. But after it became clear that it was likely the sound of a gunshot, that noise became a key marker in the timeline. Sound often brings attention before sight does. A sharp noise pulls people to their windows, or toward their front doors. But by the time they look out, the event may already be over. This is part of why crimes like this can feel so unreal. They happen quickly, then leave a silence behind them that feels impossible. Some witnesses reported seeing a man in the area. The descriptions varied, but one detail became widely repeated in media coverage. A man seen near the scene, described in a way that suggested ordinary appearance. The kind of person who could blend into a London street without drawing attention. In the early stages, police must treat these sightings carefully. They cannot assume the person seen was the offender. They have to check whether the timing matches. They have to see whether more than one witness saw the same person. They have to compare descriptions for consistency. And they have to consider how likely it is that the sighting was connected to the crime rather than coincidence. This is especially important in a city, because coincidence is common. People pass through spaces without knowing what is about to happen. Someone could have been in the area for an unrelated reason and still appear suspicious after the fact. Investigators also examined the possibility that the offender was waiting. A doorstep attack suggests either that the offender knew the victim's routine, or that the offender had chosen a moment to act quickly when the opportunity appeared. Some theories suggested a person might have been standing nearby, blending into the background, and approaching only when Jill returned home. This line of thinking leads investigators to ask a different kind of question. Not only who was seen, but who was not seen. Was there anyone who seemed to vanish suddenly? Was there anyone who changed direction quickly? Was there someone whose presence felt out of place once people looked back at the morning? Police also asked witnesses about vehicles. Whether anyone saw a car parked close by for an unusual length of time. Whether anyone saw a vehicle accelerate away. Whether any unusual van or motorcycle was present. In many cases, vehicles can provide the fastest escape from a neighborhood, but they also leave more trace. They can be remembered. They can be registered. They can be seen on cameras further out. Still, the difficulty is that London has countless vehicles moving through streets every hour. Many are unremarkable. Many are common models. Many will never stand out in memory. Another early lead investigators would have looked at was whether Jill had been followed from somewhere else. If the offender knew she was returning home, it is possible the offender watched her movements and chose the moment. This would lead police to examine where she had been that morning, what her routine was, and whether anyone had reason to know when she would be arriving. At the same time, investigators explored Jill's public life. Because she was a well-known figure, police had to consider whether she might have attracted unwanted attention. People in the public eye can become the focus of obsession, resentment, or fixation, even from strangers. This is not common, but it is serious enough that it cannot be dismissed. The fact that Jill presented Crimewatch also created an immediate thread of inquiry. Crimewatch dealt with real cases, real offenders, and public appeals. It raised the possibility that someone might have seen Jill as a symbol of policing and justice, or that someone featured on the program might have felt anger or humiliation. This theory became one of the most discussed in the years that followed, even though it was difficult to prove. In the early stage, however, investigators would have treated it as one line among many, a possibility, not a conclusion. Police also worked through Jill's personal relationships. This is standard in homicide investigations, not because investigators assume wrongdoing by those close to the victim, but because understanding someone's personal life helps build a complete picture. Investigators look for disputes, threats, unusual messages, or any sign that someone might have intended harm. But in many cases, including this one, there is no simple personal conflict that explains what happened. And when there is no clear motive, investigators are left with a wider, more complex search for meaning. Immediate leads in the Jill Dando case were shaped by the combination of factors that made the crime so disturbing. The daylight setting, the location at her front door, the quick nature of the attack, the offender's ability to disappear. These factors suggested planning, or at least preparation. They suggested a person who was not acting on a sudden impulse, but had come with intent. But intent alone does not tell you who the person is. In the early period, police appeals increased. They asked the public to come forward with information, and because Jill was widely known, the response was huge. Tips came in from across the country. Many were likely based on honest belief, but the scale of information created a challenge. A large number of tips can overwhelm an investigation. Each tip must be assessed. Each must be logged. Each must be compared against known facts. And most of them do not lead anywhere. But investigators cannot ignore them, because the one that matters might be buried among thousands. This was one of the reasons the case became so complex. It was not a quiet investigation. It was happening under national attention, with constant pressure to provide progress and answers. Witness accounts also became the focus of media discussion. People wanted certainty. They wanted a description that could produce a clear suspect. But witness descriptions rarely offer that kind of clarity. They offer fragments. A person of a certain height. A person with dark hair. A person wearing a particular type of clothing. Information that may be true, but may also be too broad to identify anyone specific. And in the absence of a clear suspect early on, the country began to live with uncertainty. Not only the uncertainty of who did it, but the unsettling idea that a person could commit a murder like this and blend back into normal life. That feeling, the idea of someone stepping away into the crowd, became part of the fear surrounding the case. London is a city that can hide people easily, not because it is dangerous by nature, but because it is enormous. It offers anonymity. It offers movement. It offers endless directions to disappear into. As investigators gathered witness accounts and pursued immediate leads, they were trying to do something very difficult. They were trying to catch a person who left almost nothing behind, someone who acted quickly, in broad daylight, and then vanished. And even now, years later, those witness accounts remain part of what makes the case so haunting. Because they remind us that the truth was close to the surface that morning, walking down a street, passing by front doors, existing in the same space as ordinary life. And still, it remained out of reach. When the news broke that Jill Dando had been killed, the reaction was immediate and widespread. This was not a case that slowly gained attention over time. It arrived with force, because Jill was not an unknown victim. She was a familiar presence, someone many people had seen for years. Someone whose voice and face belonged to the quiet routine of everyday television. For many viewers, the shock was not only sadness, but disbelief. There are certain public figures who feel safe and steady, almost like part of the furniture of national life. Jill Dando was one of those people. And when someone like that is taken suddenly, it creates a sense that something stable has been disturbed. The fact that the murder happened outside her home, in daylight, added to the impact. It felt intimate and exposed at the same time. It was not a distant crime happening somewhere anonymous. It was an attack on a doorstep, the kind of place people associate with safety, privacy, and normal life. The United Kingdom in 1999 was still shaped by shared news cycles. When something major happened, much of the country learned about it through the same outlets: radio, newspapers, and television news. There was a kind of collective attention that moved together, and Jill Dando's death became one of those moments where a nation seemed to pause. Newspapers carried large headlines. News programs led with the story. Photographs of Jill appeared everywhere. Her name was repeated again and again until it felt impossible to escape. For her family and friends, this must have been unbearable. Hearing the loss spoken about publicly while it was still raw and unreal in private. This was also the moment when the case began to take on a life beyond the crime itself. It became a public mystery. People began asking questions, not only about who did it, but about why. Why her? Why that place? Why that time? And when there is no immediate answer, the mind fills the silence with theory. The media, by its nature, does not like silence. News organizations move quickly, and in high-profile cases, they compete. They search for new angles, new details, and new explanations to keep the story moving. This is not always done out of malice. It is simply how modern attention works. But in a case like this, the speed of media attention can create pressure that affects everything around it. For the police, that pressure began almost instantly. This was not only a murder case, it was the murder of a well-known BBC presenter. The public expected progress. The government watched, the press watched, the BBC watched, and the police were expected not only to investigate thoroughly, but to do it visibly. There is a particular kind of weight that comes with a famous victim. The crime becomes symbolic. It becomes a test of competence, a test of safety, a test of whether the public can trust the authorities to solve something that feels too close for comfort. As the days went on, the scale of the investigation expanded dramatically. The police received an enormous number of tips. People called in sightings, suspicions, and theories. Some of these tips were likely given in good faith, from people who believed they had noticed something relevant. Others were driven by imagination or attention. But all had to be logged, considered, and filtered. This flood of information can be both helpful and harmful. It increases the chance that a vital detail will be discovered, but it also increases noise. It spreads resources thin. It forces investigators to spend time chasing leads that go nowhere. And, in a famous case, the amount of noise can become overwhelming. The media also examined Jill's life intensely. Her career, her relationships, her public image, and her private plans. Any detail that could suggest motive became a topic of discussion. Her role on Crimewatch became central to one major line of theory, the idea that her work might have made her a target. This theory made sense to the public in a certain way. Crimewatch was linked to real crimes and real offenders. Jill's role involved presenting cases that could lead to arrests. It was easy for people to imagine revenge, anger, or a grudge. But imagination is not evidence. And the challenge for police was to determine which theories could be supported and which were simply stories people found persuasive. Public fear grew alongside media coverage. The idea that someone could be killed on a quiet London street in daylight created anxiety, especially for those who lived in similar neighborhoods. It made people look at their own streets differently. It made people more alert when hearing footsteps behind them. It made people wonder how safe their doorsteps truly were. At the same time, Jill's death created a surge of collective grief. She was not only known as a presenter, she was known as a presence that felt gentle and familiar. People spoke about her warmth, her professionalism, and the sense of calm she brought to serious topics. That kind of public affection does not happen for every public figure. So the media pressure in this case was complicated. It was fueled by curiosity, yes, but also by sadness. People wanted answers because answers felt like a way to restore balance, to make the world feel understandable again. But murder does not always offer easy understanding, and the Jill Dando case, from the beginning, resisted simplicity. It created many questions and few solid answers. That gap between public demand and investigative reality became one of the defining tensions of the case. For investigators, the challenge was to remain steady, to avoid rushing into conclusions, to focus on evidence rather than headlines. to build a case that could hold up in court, not just a story that could satisfy public anxiety. For the public, the challenge was different. It was learning to live with uncertainty, to accept that even a famous case can remain unresolved for long stretches of time, to accept that sometimes the loudest story in the country does not end neatly. And so the case moved forward under this pressure, with thousands of tips coming in, with theories multiplying, and with investigators trying to catch something solid in the middle of all the noise. A single truth, a single link, a single piece of evidence that would turn shock into certainty. But certainty did not arrive quickly, and that slow absence of answers became part of why Jill Dando's murder remained in the national mind for so long. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation into Jill Dando's murder began to widen. This is what often happens when a case does not offer an immediate, clear suspect. The early focus on the crime scene and witness statements remains important, but police also begin to explore broader possibilities, looking outward for motive and connection. In a case as high-profile as this one, that widening process was both necessary and difficult. Necessary because the offender had not been identified quickly. Difficult because the entire country was watching, waiting, and forming opinions in real time. When investigators expand an inquiry, they do not do it by simply guessing. They follow structured lines of investigation. They look at the victim's life. They look at recent events. They look at patterns. They look for anyone who had reason to be in the area, or anyone who had expressed hostility. They look at whether the crime resembles other cases. They explore what is possible and eliminate what is not. In Jill Dando's case, several major theories became part of public discussion. Some were investigated seriously. Others remained more speculative. And because we are telling this story carefully, it is important to separate the confirmed lines of inquiry from the claims that grew louder in the public imagination. One of the first and most obvious lines of inquiry involved Jill's personal life. Investigators examined her relationships, her routines, and any known conflicts. This is standard in homicide investigations, not because police assume the answer is always close to home, but because understanding a person's life is a way of understanding the possible reasons someone might wish to harm them. But Jill's personal life, as far as confirmed reporting suggested, did not offer a clear motive. She was engaged. She had friends and family. She had no widely known personal disputes that could easily explain such a targeted act. That absence of an obvious personal motive pushed attention toward her public life. Another major line of inquiry involved Jill's work on Crimewatch. Crimewatch was a program that presented reconstructions of real crimes and appealed to the public for help. It was closely linked to policing and public participation. The show had helped identify suspects and solve cases over the years. Because of this, people naturally wondered whether Jill might have been targeted by someone connected to one of the cases featured. This idea became one of the most persistent theories. It felt plausible to many people because it created a narrative. Jill presents crime cases, a criminal seeks revenge, and the crime is carried out with chilling precision. But plausible is not the same as proven. Investigators did look at this possibility. They examined whether any particular broadcast had triggered threats or unusual reactions. They considered whether any offender might have held a grudge against the show, or against Jill personally as its presenter. They also explored whether any known criminals had reason to know where Jill lived. This last detail is important. Knowing someone's address is not always difficult, especially for a public figure. But that does not mean every person who knows an address has motive or intent. The challenge for police was to find an actual link, something concrete that connected a particular individual or group to the crime. Another theory that entered public discussion involved the possibility of a stalker or an obsessed fan. Public figures can attract fixation, sometimes from individuals who feel a false sense of closeness. They may believe they are in a relationship with someone they have never met. They may feel entitled to attention. They may develop resentment when reality does not match the fantasy. These cases are rare, but they are serious, and they cannot be ignored. Investigators considered whether Jill had received troubling letters or communications. They looked into whether anyone had tried to approach her inappropriately. They examined whether there were any patterns that suggested unwanted attention. A stalker-based theory also fit another aspect of the case. The crime appeared targeted and personal, even though it happened quickly. Some people believed that whoever committed it wanted to get close enough to be certain of who she was, and then act immediately. At the same time, police also had to consider whether the murder could have been a mistaken identity. This theory often appears in cases where a victim's daily routine seems unconnected to obvious risk. Mistaken identity is a possibility in some crimes, but it is also difficult to prove, because it requires an alternative target who resembles the victim or lived in the same area. Investigators would have reviewed whether anyone else living nearby had connections to danger or conflict. They would have examined whether the timing and location could point toward someone else, and whether Jill might have been misidentified. Another line of inquiry involved whether the murder might have been connected to larger criminal groups. This theory became widely discussed because it offered a grander explanation. The idea that Jill might have been targeted by organized crime for reasons unknown to the public. One version of this theory suggested that Jill's work might have intersected with powerful people or sensitive topics. Another version suggested a foreign connection, sometimes linked to political conflict outside the UK. In particular, speculation emerged about whether the murder could have been connected to political or criminal groups in the Balkans, with some theories claiming Jill's Crimewatch work had a connection to coverage of events in that region. These theories were widely repeated in the media over time, but they remained disputed and were never officially confirmed as the reason for her murder. They became part of the case's mythology, in part because the crime itself felt so unusual and unresolved. When a case lacks a clear motive, people tend to reach for big explanations. They prefer a story that feels dramatic enough to match the shock. But the truth does not always match the shape of the fear. The police also explored the possibility of local criminal involvement. Sometimes a crime that looks planned can still be carried out by someone closer to the scene than anyone expects. Someone who knew the area well. Someone who could move through it comfortably. Someone who could appear ordinary and disappear quickly. Investigators considered whether the murder weapon had been used in other crimes. They examined forensic evidence carefully. They worked with specialists. They revisited witness statements. They looked for patterns that could link this murder to others, either through method or through evidence. The difficulty in this case was that the visible facts were simple. Jill was killed at her doorstep. The offender left quickly. The scene offered only limited physical trace. Without a strong forensic link, investigations can become like searching in fog. So police broadened the search. They interviewed large numbers of people. They reviewed enormous volumes of information. They attempted to build connections that could stand up under scrutiny. And as time passed, the lack of resolution itself became part of the pressure. This is often where investigations become vulnerable to public demand. When a case is famous and unsolved, people start wanting an answer more than they want uncertainty. They want a name, they want a motive, they want closure. And when closure does not come, suspicion can drift in unpredictable directions. In the Jill Dando case, the investigation expanded through many lines of inquiry, some grounded in her public work, some grounded in her personal life, and some emerging from wider speculation. The police worked through them systematically, but the case did not produce the kind of definitive breakthrough the public expected. Instead, it moved forward unevenly. Progress appeared and faded. Leads emerged and failed. Theories were explored and then left behind. And this widening investigation, filled with both serious inquiry and public imagination, set the stage for what would later become the most significant and controversial legal chapter in the case. The arrest and trial of Barry George, and the courtroom battle over what evidence truly meant. That is where the story goes next, into the part where uncertainty meets prosecution, and where the desire for answers begins to shape the case in ways that would later be debated for years. As the investigation continued into Jill Dando's murder, the pressure to solve the case remained intense. It had become one of the most high-profile killings in modern British history, and each year that passed without an answer deepened the sense of unfinished shock. The public still remembered Jill's face, the media still returned to her name, and the police still carried the expectation that this case would eventually be resolved. Almost a year after the murder, in May of 2000, a man named Barry George was arrested in connection with the case. This was a major development, and it immediately changed the public atmosphere. For the first time, there was a named suspect. For the first time, the case seemed to be moving toward a formal legal conclusion. Barry George was not a public figure like Jill. He was a private individual, and in the public mind, the contrast between the victim and the suspect was striking. When someone well-known is murdered, people often imagine the offender as someone equally dramatic or connected to large motives. But sometimes investigations point elsewhere, toward individuals who have lived largely outside public attention. Barry George was charged with Jill Dando's murder, and the case eventually moved to trial. When a trial begins in a case like this, the focus shifts again. The public stops asking who might have done it, and begins listening for what the prosecution can prove. Trials are not driven by rumors, headlines, or popular theories. They are driven by evidence. The prosecution must present a case strong enough to convince a jury beyond reasonable doubt. The defense must challenge that case, not necessarily by proving innocence with absolute certainty, but by showing uncertainty, gaps, or alternative explanations. The Barry George trial became deeply significant because the case against him was largely circumstantial. There was no widely reported eyewitness who identified him as the gunman. There was no simple confession. Instead, the prosecution relied on the accumulation of details, forensic interpretation, and the argument that these details pointed toward Barry George as the offender. One of the most talked about aspects of the trial involved forensic evidence, described as gunshot residue, or a particle that prosecutors argued was consistent with firearm discharge. This evidence became a major point of contention, both during the trial and in later years. In calm, respectful storytelling, it is important to state this carefully. The prosecution presented forensic material that they argued linked Barry George to the crime. The defense challenged that interpretation and argued that the evidence was weak, unreliable, or capable of innocent explanation. This is where many true crime cases become complicated. Forensic evidence can sound definitive in headlines, but in court, it often comes with nuance. Experts can disagree. Testing methods have limitations, and small pieces of evidence can be interpreted in different ways depending on context. The prosecution also presented other elements that they argued supported their case. They examined Barry George's movements and circumstances. They explored his background. They attempted to show that he had a connection to Jill Dando in the sense of interest or fixation, though the degree of that connection was disputed. In many cases involving public figures, the idea of obsession becomes part of the narrative. Jurors are asked to consider whether the suspect had motive rooted in fixation, resentment, or fantasy. These motives are difficult to prove directly because they exist in the mind, not on paper. Instead, prosecutors rely on patterns of behavior and circumstantial indicators. The defense pushed back on this approach. They argued that suspicion is not proof. They challenged the strength of the evidence, and they emphasized that the case did not include direct confirmation that Barry George committed the crime. As the trial unfolded, the country watched closely. The murder of Jill Dando had created an enormous appetite for resolution, and the trial represented the possibility that the story would finally settle into an answer. In a nation still unsettled by the shock of her death, many people wanted to believe that the justice system had reached the truth. In July of 2001, Barry George was convicted of Jill Dando's murder. For some, this conviction felt like the case had finally reached closure. It provided a legal conclusion. It gave the public a name to attach to the crime. It allowed people to believe that the offender had been identified and that Jill's death had not been left unresolved. But even at the time, there were questions. This conviction did not end public debate. Instead, it began a new chapter of debate, because some observers felt the evidence was not strong enough to justify a conviction. Others believed the conviction was correct, and that the jury had reached the right decision based on what was presented. This is one of the most difficult realities in true crime. Sometimes the legal outcome is accepted widely. Sometimes it remains controversial. And when it remains controversial, the case stays alive in public memory. Not because people want drama, but because uncertainty remains. The years after Barry George's conviction were shaped by appeals and continued legal arguments. The defense continued to challenge the conviction. Questions about the forensic evidence continued to be discussed, and the case moved into a phase where the legal system had to revisit whether the conviction was safe. After Barry George was convicted of Jill Dando's murder in July 2001, the case entered a stage that many people do not always think about when they imagine criminal justice. The period after a verdict, when legal arguments continue, evidence is re-examined, and the question shifts from guilt in the public mind to safety of conviction in the legal mind. A conviction can feel final to the public. It carries the weight of courtroom decision and the sense that an ending has been reached. But in serious cases, especially those built on circumstantial evidence, the process often continues for years. Appeals exist for a reason. They are a safeguard, a way to ensure that the trial was fair, that procedures were correct, and that evidence was properly handled and properly understood. In the Jill Dando case, questions did not fade after the conviction. They grew. The case against Barry George had always been controversial because it relied heavily on circumstantial reasoning and on forensic interpretation that was debated. As time passed, that debate did not settle into quiet acceptance. It remained active in legal circles, in media coverage, and among those who followed the case closely. The appeal process became a focal point. In the United Kingdom, appeals are not simply a second chance to argue the same case. An appeal requires legal grounds. It requires reasons why the conviction may be unsafe. That can involve new evidence, concerns about how evidence was presented, or concerns about the way the trial was conducted. Barry George appealed his conviction, and for a time, the conviction remained in place. Courts initially upheld the verdict, meaning the legal system, at that stage, did not agree that the conviction should be overturned. This is important to understand. The existence of controversy does not automatically lead to legal reversal. Courts require specific reasons, supported by legal argument and evidence. But over time, the focus returned repeatedly to the forensic evidence that had played such a prominent role at trial. In particular, the tiny particle that had been presented as potentially linked to gunshot residue became a central subject of scrutiny. In cases like this, small forensic details can carry huge weight, because if the case lacks direct evidence, the smallest physical trace can become the anchor point for the prosecution's story. As forensic understanding develops, and as evidence is re-evaluated, earlier interpretations can be questioned. Not always because they were dishonest, but because science is not static. Methods improve, standards rise, and what once seemed strong can later seem uncertain. This was part of what happened in the Jill Dando case. The reliability and significance of the forensic evidence was increasingly challenged, and that challenge became more difficult to ignore. Eventually, the Court of Appeal ruled that Barry George's conviction was unsafe, and the conviction was quashed. This was a major legal turning point. It meant that the earlier guilty verdict could no longer stand under law. When a conviction is quashed, it does not automatically mean a person is declared innocent in a broad moral sense. It means that the legal system has determined that conviction is not safe, meaning the evidence and process were not strong enough to uphold guilt beyond reasonable doubt. After the conviction was quashed, there was a retrial. This is another aspect of the legal system that can feel confusing from the outside. When a conviction is overturned, prosecutors may still believe the suspect is responsible, and they may pursue another trial if they believe the case can be proven. In this situation, the legal question returns to the courtroom again, but under a new landscape. Evidence is reconsidered. The weaknesses are now known. The prosecution must decide what can truly be presented as strong enough to convince a jury. In 2008, Barry George was found not guilty at retrial and was acquitted. That acquittal changed the official status of the case. It meant Barry George could not be treated as the convicted killer under law, and it meant the murder of Jill Dando returned to the category of an unresolved case in the public mind, even though it had once seemed solved. For many people, this outcome brought a different kind of unease. A conviction can be uncomfortable, but it at least provides a sense of closure. When that conviction is overturned, and the defendant is acquitted, the mind returns to the original question that had haunted the country from the beginning. If he did not do it, then who did? This is the kind of question that can keep a case alive for decades. It pulls people back into theories, into speculation, into searching for patterns. It creates a space where the story does not end cleanly, and where public memory keeps circling around the same unresolved center. For Jill Dando's family and friends, legal reversals are not experienced as intellectual debate. They are experienced as another destabilization, another shift in what is known, another reopening of grief, another reminder that justice does not always arrive in a single, certain form. It is also important to consider what this sequence reveals about criminal investigations. It shows how difficult it can be to solve a case without strong, direct evidence. It shows how tempting it can be for a single piece of forensic material to become the foundation of an entire prosecution story. And it shows why the legal system has layers of review, because the cost of certainty built on weak ground is too high. The conviction, the appeal, and the acquittal became part of why Jill Dando's case remained so widely discussed. Not only because she was famous, but because the legal process itself became part of the mystery. The public did not just watch a murder investigation, they watched the justice system struggle to hold the case in a final shape. And in the quiet years that followed, the result was a strange kind of unresolved ending. Jill Dando remained gone. The crime remained real. The shock remained in memory. But the identity of the person responsible remained officially unsettled. That is one of the hardest truths in true crime. Some cases do not resolve in a way that feels satisfying or complete. They remain open wounds in the history of a country, remembered not only for what happened, but for what could not be proven. Jill Dando's murder became one of those cases, a story that began on an ordinary morning in Fulham and continued for years in courtrooms and headlines, leaving behind an absence that could not be filled by legal outcomes alone. Even after the conviction was overturned and Barry George was acquitted, the murder of Jill Dando did not leave the public mind. In some ways, it became even more haunting because the case returned to the same uncomfortable place it had occupied at the beginning. A known victim, a known moment, a confirmed crime, and no officially confirmed answer to the question of who did it. When a case remains unresolved, it creates a certain kind of gravity. It pulls people back in, again and again, not because they want drama, but because the human mind struggles with unfinished stories. It wants to believe the world makes sense. It wants to believe that when something terrible happens, the truth will be discovered and held firmly in place. But some cases resist that, and Jill Dando's murder is one of them. There are unanswered questions in this case that have remained consistent for years. The first is the simplest one. Who was the person at the door? The crime happened quickly, and yet it required proximity. It required the offender to be close enough to act and then leave. How did that person approach? Were they waiting? Did they arrive just as Jill returned? Did they know her routine? Or did they simply get lucky in terms of timing? These questions matter because they shape how people imagine the offender. A person waiting suggests planning and patience. A person arriving at the same moment could suggest surveillance, or it could suggest coincidence. The difference between those possibilities changes the entire profile of what investigators might be looking for. Another question that remains central is motive. Motive is not always necessary to solve a case, but it often provides a thread to follow. It narrows the search. It gives direction. Without motive, an investigation can become wide and fog-like, full of possibilities that are hard to eliminate. In Jill Dando's case, the motive has never been officially established. Some theories focus on her public life. Some focus on her work. Some focus on her personal circumstances. Some suggest a connection to crime, to revenge, or to obsession. But none have been proven in a way that brought a final resolution. One of the most persistent and widely discussed theories involves Jill's role as the presenter of Crimewatch. This theory suggests that her work may have connected her indirectly to offenders who felt exposed or threatened. The logic of the theory is simple. Crimewatch helped identify criminals. Jill presented those cases. Therefore, a criminal might target her. But there is a difference between logical storytelling and confirmed evidence. Police did consider this line of inquiry. It was natural to examine whether any particular case broadcast could have triggered threats or anger. But the difficulty is establishing a direct connection that can be proven. To prove a theory like this, investigators would need a specific offender who had both motive and the ability to carry out the crime. They would need evidence that the person knew where Jill lived. They would need evidence that the person acted with intent and planning. Without that, the theory remains an idea, persuasive to some, but not anchored firmly to fact. Another continuing theory involves the possibility of obsession or stalking. Jill Dando was a well-known and widely liked television presenter. Public figures can attract fixation, sometimes from individuals who believe they have a personal relationship with someone they have only seen on a screen. If the offender was someone like this, the crime could have been personal in the offender's mind, even if there was no personal relationship in reality. This theory can explain why the crime appears targeted without requiring a professional or organized motive. But again, the challenge is proof. Obsession is hard to demonstrate conclusively after a crime unless there is a trail of communication, documented behavior, or admissions that can be verified. There has also been public speculation about organized crime involvement. Some people have suggested that Jill may have been targeted as part of something larger, a decision made beyond her knowledge, a crime committed for reasons that were never going to be obvious. This theory often appeals to people because it explains the speed, the silence, and the absence of a clear motive. It creates a sense that the murder was carried out by someone experienced, someone who knew how to disappear. But the danger of this theory is that it can become too broad. Organized crime can become a placeholder explanation when the true answer is unknown. It can fill a gap without providing evidence. A related form of speculation involves political motives, including theories that Jill's murder could have been linked to international conflict or groups. Outside the UK, these claims have circulated for years, and they often gain attention because they feel dramatic and complex enough to match the shock of the crime. However, these theories remain disputed and unproven. They exist mostly in public debate rather than official resolution, and they should be treated cautiously for that reason. Another unanswered question involves the offender's ability to vanish. Gowan Avenue is not a remote location. It is part of a city. There are houses nearby, roads nearby, movement nearby. Yet the crime occurred, and the offender escaped without being clearly identified. This raises questions about whether the offender lived locally, whether the offender knew the area well, or whether the offender had an escape plan. It also raises the possibility that the offender looked ordinary enough to disappear into the environment without drawing attention. One of the unsettling truths about city life is that a person can commit a crime and then blend back into normal life quickly if they do not stand out. In a place like London, someone walking away calmly can look like anyone else walking home. There is also the question of the weapon. Firearms are not commonly used in UK crimes compared to some other countries, and that fact shaped public reaction. The presence of a gun suggested either access or intent. It suggested a crime that was not impulsive, and it suggested an offender who came prepared. But the case has never delivered a definitive, publicly confirmed narrative about where the weapon came from, how it was obtained, or whether it was connected to other crimes in a traceable way. And without that, the weapon remains another piece of the puzzle that does not lock neatly into place. A difficult truth about the Jill Dando case is that even after years of investigation, legal proceedings, and public scrutiny, the case remains unresolved. That does not mean investigators did not work hard. It does not mean evidence was not gathered. It means the evidence that exists has not been enough to establish one final answer that can stand firmly under law. This is what keeps the theories alive. People return to the case because it feels incomplete. They look for connections. They search for overlooked details. They wonder whether the truth is close, hidden in something small. But theories are not closure. They are a way of holding uncertainty. And for a case like this, where the victim was so visible and so widely loved, uncertainty feels especially cruel. Because if the murderer is unknown, then the story remains open. Not just for the public, but for those closest to Jill. It remains an absence without resolution. A wound that never receives the one thing people often crave after a loss like this: an answer. In calm reflection, it is important to accept that unanswered questions are sometimes part of reality. The world does not always offer neat conclusions. Some crimes remain unsolved, not because the truth does not exist, but because it cannot be proven with the evidence that remains. And in the Jill Dando case, that is where things stand. A crime that shocked the nation, a legal process that shifted dramatically over time, and a final reality that still feels unsettled. A familiar street, a sudden act, a life taken, and the questions still hanging quietly in the air, year after year. Who did it? There is a particular kind of sadness that settles over cases like this one. Not only because a life was taken, but because the story never found a clean place to rest. When a case remains unresolved, the mind keeps circling back, as if turning it over again might reveal something new. But time does not always bring clarity. Sometimes it only deepens the quiet weight of what is not known. Jill Dando's murder stays in the memory of the United Kingdom for many reasons. She was well known. She was widely liked. She was a steady presence on television. But beyond that, the case lingers because it happened in a way that felt deeply unsettling. It happened in daylight, in a familiar residential street. And it happened at the boundary between public life and private life, right at the door of her home. That boundary matters more than we often realize. For most people, home is not only a place, but a feeling. It is where the body relaxes. It is where the face changes. It is where you stop performing for the world. Even if your life is busy, even if you carry stress, home is usually the place where you can breathe without being watched. When violence reaches that boundary, it does something to the mind. It creates a sense that privacy is fragile. It makes people wonder whether safety is real, or whether it is only the illusion created by routine. In Jill Dando's case, that fragile point was exposed in the most public way possible. She was known across the country, and yet she was killed in the most private space imaginable, right outside her own door. It was a moment that made many people feel that if something could happen to someone like her, in a place like that, then the world was less predictable than it seemed. This is where the idea of public life becomes important. Jill's public presence was built on trust. People invited her into their homes through the television screen. They watched her speak calmly about serious topics. They watched her guide programs that dealt with real cases and real victims. And over time, she became familiar in a way that felt almost personal. But public familiarity is not the same as real closeness. It does not come with protection. It does not guarantee safety. In fact, it can sometimes create risk, because public visibility makes you recognizable, and recognizability can bring attention that is unwanted or unsafe. That is the contradiction of being known. The public feels close to you, but you cannot know who is watching. You cannot know who is carrying an idea about you that does not match reality. You cannot know who has decided, privately and silently, that you matter to them in a way that is not healthy or safe. And even if none of that is what happened in this case, the possibility alone is enough to make people uneasy, because it reminds us of how thin the line can be between the life we live outwardly and the safety we assume inwardly. It is also worth reflecting on something quieter: the way people respond when a familiar face is lost. The public reaction to Jill Dando's murder was not only curiosity, it was grief, a collective grief, even among people who did not know her personally. That kind of grief can feel strange, but it has a real source. It comes from repetition, from years of seeing someone, hearing someone, trusting someone's presence as part of ordinary life. When that presence disappears, it leaves a gap that feels bigger than it should. Not because the public owns the person, but because the person had become part of the fabric of normal life. And when normal life is disrupted, people feel it deeply. But the deepest grief always belongs to the private circle. The family and friends who knew Jill without cameras. The people who shared meals, conversations, jokes, and plans. The people who would have expected to see her again, to talk to her again, to hear her voice in a completely ordinary way. For them, the case is not a mystery to discuss. It is a loss to live with. A loss that does not soften just because time passes. It becomes something they carry quietly while the world moves forward. In a strange way, unresolved cases can make grief harder. When there is no final answer, there is also no final release. There is no moment when the story settles fully into certainty. The mind stays slightly open, slightly searching, slightly waiting. And waiting is exhausting. This is why the story of Jill Dando continues to feel so heavy, not only because it was tragic, but because the conclusion never arrived in a way that felt firm enough to hold. And yet, there is still something gentle that can be taken from a case like this, even in the darkness of it. A reminder to be aware of how fragile daily life can be. A reminder to cherish ordinary moments. A reminder that people who seem strong and successful still carry the same human vulnerability as anyone else. Public life can appear bright, polished, and protected. But behind that brightness is still a person who walks up a front step, unlocks a door, carries shopping, makes plans, and expects tomorrow to come. Jill Dando was that person, a human being living inside a public image, trying to live a normal life beneath it. And the tragedy of her death is not only that she was taken, but that the taking happened in a way that left the entire country unsettled. So tonight, as we let this case settle, we do not try to force closure. We do not pretend the story is neatly finished. We simply allow it to rest in the truth of what is known. A life mattered. A life ended. A case remained unresolved. And even without answers, remembrance still has value. Saying her name with respect, remembering her as a person and not a theory, holding her story gently, without turning it into entertainment. Because when the night gets quiet, that is what remains. Not the headlines, not the arguments, just the simple truth that a person was here and then was gone. And that absence deserves to be acknowledged with care. As this story begins to fade into the background, it is okay to let the unanswered parts soften. Some cases end with certainty and a clear conclusion. This one does not. It lingers in the mind because it remains unresolved, and because it happened in a place that felt so ordinary, a quiet doorstep on a familiar street. But tonight, you do not need to carry the questions with you. You do not need to solve anything. You do not need to hold the theories in your mind or replay the timeline. The truth is that the case has already been searched, examined, debated, and revisited for years. And still, the final certainty so many people wanted never arrived. So you can let it rest. If you are still awake, allow your thoughts to loosen their grip. Let them become slower and less sharp. Let them drift the way streetlights drift past a car window when you are half asleep, present for a moment, then gone again. Take a slow breath in through your nose, and let it out gently. Feel your body settle into the surface beneath you. Feel your shoulders become heavier. Feel your hands soften. Let your face relax as if it has permission to stop holding the day. In the quiet, it is easy to feel the weight of stories like this. They remind us that life can change quickly. They remind us that safety is something we often assume without noticing. And they remind us that even people who seem protected by fame and public attention are still human, still vulnerable, still living normal lives beneath the surface. But the purpose of this channel is not to leave you tense or alert. It is to bring the story to a calm ending and return you to stillness. So let the sound of my voice become less important. Let it become part of the room, like the hum of distant night traffic, or the soft movement of air. You are here now. You are safe in this moment. The doors are closed. The night is outside. Your body is allowed to rest. If you feel your mind returning to details, gently guide it back to something simple. Your breathing, the slow rise and fall of your chest, the warmth of your blanket, the comfort of knowing you do not have to do anything else tonight. Nothing is required from you. No decisions. No answers, no effort, just rest. And if sleep comes, let it come naturally, without trying to control it. Let it take you the way darkness takes a room when the last light is turned off, quietly and completely. Thank you for spending this time with me tonight, and thank you for listening with respect and patience. Wherever you are, I hope your night is calm. I hope your thoughts become gentle. And I hope sleep finds you easily, like a slow wave washing over the shore. Good night.